want to go back, first trend that you mentioned in terms of consolidations within the record-keeping world.
Yep.
And it's driven down costs, or it has the potential to drive down costs.
Absolutely.
I read a quote from Warren Buffett recently where he said that cost is the price that you pay for a good or service. The value is what you actually receive in return. How do you, as a consultant, evaluate value going beyond the actual cost or price that your clients are paying for a good or service, such as record-keeping services or education services or whatever it might be? Tell me a little bit about what you do to evaluate that.
Cost is obviously an important component.
It is.
With the new fee disclosure rules, everyone's focused on it. It's quantifiable, it's easier to understand, it's not as touchy-feely as some of the more qualitative aspects of looking at a record keeper, but it is about value and how do you, as a record keeper, and really you're more of a service provider or a record keeper rather than a vendor or a record keeper. There's a longer standing relationship, and so it's about how do you deliver on what you've stated you're gonna work on for the year. It's laying out a strategy, a communications and education strategy, a strategy for improving, driving results, and then revisiting that on a year-by-year basis. And so when we're working with clients, yeah, of course we're looking at the cost, but we're looking at things like administration. Where has the record keeper or vendor or service provider been successful in outsourcing administration to drive down costs? Where have they been successful in driving events for the program, so driving up participation? And I think really that's really the narrative. It's less about, hey, these nuts and bolts things about cost. Yeah, sure, it's important, but Arista is pretty clear. It's not the cheapest. If that were the case, we'd all be invested in passive funds. It's where does the value and so exist. And so as consultants, advisors, we have to look at differentiators like cybersecurity, cyber protection, differentiators like use of technology, wearables, phone apps, tablets, things like that in order to drive results. We're really doing a lot of heavy lifting in that area as an organization, and I think it's those things that record keepers can do to bring value to their clients.
That brings us to the third point you brought up, was about communication education, strategic involvement with that. So we also talked earlier today, before we got in front of the cameras, and we were talking about auto escalation, auto enrollment, and the auto features continue to see more adoption, but not quite at the rate that a lot of folks in the industry would like to see if we're really talking about participant outcomes. How do you see that education can really help bridge that gap? What is it that for you and for your firm you're seeing the cutting edge from an educational perspective to help those plans drive in participation, close in terms of for each individual participant, close that income gap that they need to for income replacement for retirement? What do you see the trends are there?
I think number one, it's knowing what the goal and purpose is of your retirement plan. So when the plans were incepted, there may have been a defined benefit plan, this may have been a supplemental plan, but things have shifted over time. So as a committee, as a fiduciary, you've got to understand where you're headed. I have an old mentor that used to say to me, Columbus didn't just set sail, he sailed west. It's kind of corny, but it makes sense. You've got to have a goal and an objective in order to achieve it. So I think it's revisiting that. In terms of a communications and education strategy, I think what you do is you think about knowing your goals and objectives. If you want to replace 80% of income, as an example. So it's quantifying in those terms, not quantifying it in pure dollars, because $1 million in my lifestyle may be different than your lifestyle.
Right.
And therefore it doesn't make sense, but it's really, I need 85%. So you quantify it in those terms. And then you build a strategy in order to get people there. But with any communication strategy, it's benchmarking and assessing. So it's looking at other organizations within your industry, seeing how your participants are doing relative to theirs. And it's also benchmarking the plan over time. So it's to measure that growth. I think there's a lot of, I do think that communication education is very important, and I think segmenting the employee populations and looking at data is something that's really going to help make an impact. And of course, using technology is important. Plan design still is king, and I write about this in the article it's going to be released in January. You've got to have a good foundation from which to drive results. So I think that's important. You mentioned auto enrollment, auto escalation. I would augment that by saying auto enroll at a higher rate, auto escalate at more than 1%, shooting for between 15 and 20% total deferral. That needs to be the norm because people are not going to get to that 85% replacement ratio. Right. So I think the conversations we're having are much more strategic and tactical. And we have to change the conversation with our committees at with their buy-in, of course. I mean, you can't just come in and change the agenda, but you have to get them to say, we want to talk more about education. We want to drive plan results. Because if someone doesn't retire on time, and I know we've talked about this in other interviews, if someone doesn't retire on time, that's a higher cost. It's more overhead, and it gets in the way of other people who would come and become the future leaders of tomorrow in the organization.
Exactly. Exactly.
Exactly.
Exactly. Exactly. Exactly. Exactly. Exactly. Exactly. Exactly. Exactly. Exactly. Exactly. Exactly. Exactly. Exactly. Exactly.